to see so many faces, at least remotely, looking at the Zoom screen. It's great to see you all. For those of you that were able to join us for the holiday party, a big thanks. It was a great success and had a great time, and it was wonderful catching up with so many folks in person. We'll be having an event like that again at the end of our spring semester. And before I dive into today's talk, I just wanted to give you a preview of the events that we have scheduled for the upcoming new year, or spring semester, as we call it in academic land. Again, I would just ask you to take a minute and go through this list and, make some notes about what you would like to attend, but also think about who you might invite to one of these events. That could be a friend, a neighbor, a son or daughter, a son or daughter of a friend. I recently had somebody say that, they really liked bringing clients to the Weidenbaum event. It was a little bit more of a sort of a shared intellectual experience, as opposed to, a lunch where somebody knew they were going to get asked for something by someone else. So, bring your clients to these events. All you have to do is let me or Molly Klein or Steve Knight or Alana know, and we'll make sure that they get a warm welcome when they come and see us. It's really a great program we have set up for the spring. We're co-sponsoring an event with CRE 2, bringing in the really phenomenal author Heather McGee. She's written a wildly popular book called The Sum of Us. And we'll be giving a talk, I believe it's in Graham Chapel in February. We'll have a discussion of the situation in Israel. In March, we'll do a public policy event on education, which I'm really excited about. We'll also change up formats a little bit, and it'll be a happy hour as opposed to our normal lunch. As part of our continued collaboration with the Pulitzer Foundation, we'll be welcoming Emmy Award-winning journalist Hilke Schellman, on the very uninteresting, esoteric topic of artificial intelligence, right, that we're all thinking about these days. So that'll be phenomenal. I've somehow convinced Mark Wrighton to come and join us to talk about the politics of being a university president, something he knows just a little bit about. So he'll join us for a conversation in April, and then we'll kick it off with or end it with our current chancellor, Andrew Martin, who will join us for our annual reception. We'll be awarding him the Weidenbaum Center, the Award for Excellence, and so it's sure to be a great time. The other thing I'll mention, this isn't on the list yet, but we will be joined at some point in the spring by Adriana Kugler, who is one of the 7 members of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve. She'll be visiting St. Louis, and Steve Fazzari is helping making an arrangement for her visit. So that will also be a really phenomenal experience. So I want you to come to these events, but like I said, get your friends, neighbors, family, clients, bring them in as guests and share some of the wonderful things that we're able to do with the Weidenbaum Center with your friends and family. Okay, so without further ado, let me go ahead and get started with the talk today. I guess I can't really say thank you for having me. You had no choice. I scheduled it myself. But it is an honor to be here today to share with all of you some of the research that I've been working on. The talk today is based on research that comes from a number of studies that have been peer-reviewed and published, both in my book as well as a number of articles. The focus of the talk today is how Americans feel about unilateral presidential power. Now, one perspective that might immediately jump to your mind is that, given partisan polarization, presidential supporters are simply going to hand the president a blank check, right, to do whatever he or she chooses. But in our book, we argue that this isn't the case. This is an important question. One, because the ability to constrain executive power bears directly on the health of American democracy. Right? A lot of times when we think about the health of a democracy, we think about, are elections free and fair? How are they being conducted? Those are very important phenomena to keep in mind. But truly, one of the greatest threats to democracy worldwide is that a popular chief executive will weaken or eliminate democratic institutions, right, without so much as a peep, right, and maybe even some cheering by the public. So while our book mostly includes evidence from surveys, right, from citizens, from Americans, the bigger question we ask, and I and my co-author, who I'll mention in a moment, we're both scholars of the presidency, right? We're interested in how we check executive power, how we check presidential power, which seems to grow unencumbered. So I'm going to share some results with you. I want to note, if you have any questions at any point, you can type them in the chat. If you don't want to type them in the chat, you can email them to Alana, Alana will put her email address in the chat there, and she can relay the questions to me. But feel free to ask at any point any question you might have. Just put it in the chat there. Okay, so presidents have increasingly used unilateral actions to accomplish their policy goals. Right, pictured here are the last 9 presidents sitting at desks signing executive orders. So today, the focus is not just executive orders, but all implements of unilateral presidential power, right? Without a focus on whether it's a memoranda, an executive agreement, an executive order, or the like, right? In terms of understanding how the public is viewing it, we're a little less concerned about the specific implement. And if you think about high-profile executive actions, right, DACA might come to mind. DACA was not an executive order. DACA was a memo issued by Napolitano in the federal bureaucracy, right? So we're not focused on those technical details in what I'm going to share with you today, right? Our focus is how the public reacts to these approaches. I can probably say this to this crowd. I can't really say this to my undergrads. I can't say, let us remember back to the Obama administration, because most of them cannot do that. But I imagine most of us here today can recall back to the Obama administration, when as a candidate, right, Obama was very critical of executive power. But as a president, he came to embrace it. Right? He used unilateral powers to try to accomplish a wide range of policy outcomes, including rejecting the Keystone Pipeline, right, making recess appointments, gun control, and so on and so on and so on. Now, many Americans did not like that Obama was taking these executive actions. Perhaps front and center in that line of folks was John Boehner, pictured here back when he was Speaker of the House. In late 2014, Boehner declared that he was going to sue Obama over his use of unilateral power, and did exactly that one day after Obama announced unilateral action on immigration. The suit itself was actually related to the implementation of Obamacare. So Boehner wrote an op-ed explaining why he was doing this, and he said that the president has circumvented the American people and their elected representatives through executive action, as if daring the American people to stop him. But one of our central questions in the book is, to Speaker Boehner's claim, do the American people actually care? After all, if we recall the 2020 election, we had candidates running on unilateral power agendas. Here's a headline that details the plans of then candidate Harris using unilateral power to accomplish her goals if she were to be elected president. Former President Trump has already made strengthening and expanding the powers of the presidency a central part of his reelection campaign in this current election cycle. Right? Perhaps we can come back to his interview last week where he declared he would be dictator, but only for a day. I think that reveals some information about what we find here in the book. This isn't a partisan thing. In 2016, Hillary Clinton ran on an agenda of executive power. According to some in the media, it came at no political cost. And that's because, as others claimed, right, executive orders are about process, and the public just doesn't care about process, right? Certainly not outside of Washington, D.C., or thus is the claim. So how do Americans view presidential power? Do they care about presidential power, or do they simply follow the partisan winds of whichever candidate they support? Right, that's one of the central questions in my book, No Blank Check, which I've co-authored with Professor John Rogowski of the University of Chicago. We don't write mystery novels or mystery books in political science. So I'll tell you, right, we argue that the public does in fact react negatively to unilateral power. And today I want to give you a tour of these attitudes and consider some of their origins. In other parts of the book, which I won't focus on as much today, we also explore the nature of the public penalty when presidents decide to go it alone. So let me back up just a little bit and let's lay out three potential answers to this question of how might Americans view presidential power? And then I'm going to sort of go down each of these paths a bit. So first is the idea that Americans don't care, right? They simply have no attitudes towards presidential power. A second perspective is that to the extent they do, it's going to be driven primarily by partisanship. The third perspective, which I'll be presenting some evidence of here today, is that Americans, when it comes to presidential power, do actually have an institutional lens that they bring to some of these questions. Okay, so first is this idea that Americans may not have any views of presidential power. All right, just to be clear now, my slide does not say the masses are Democrats. Okay, this is supposed to rhyme. The American public, we know, has low levels of political knowledge, which render them incapable of mustering a view of the means by which something gets done, right? And the question is, how strong is that linkage, right? This perspective suggests that Americans are just too ignorant of politics to care about questions around process. If we look at surveys that find that less than half of Americans can name the three branches, right? Surely they're not going to be paying attention to obscure questions of how a president is exercising power. I'll quickly say we don't find much evidence for this perspective for most people that we're able to survey. So second is a perspective that partisanship will drive attitudes towards presidential power, right? This is the tricky one and the one that sort of gives us some pause and concern vis-a-vis democracy. So this is related to the first perspective that I just mentioned, but instead of ignorance, it's partisanship that fills the void. And in the extreme, it's partisanship that's perfectly going to predict support for unilateral power. Right, to take a bit of an extreme example, right, Donald Trump, along with others who didn't like Obama, disliked unilateral action when Obama was exercising it. But then when Trump became president, all of a sudden, like, he really liked unilateral action. This is a very consistent pattern that we see. This is not a Trump-specific phenomena. The candidate yet to be turned president they really harp on and dislike unilateral power and then witness a bit of a change when they actually come to office. Again, this is a perspective that raises some distressing implications for democracy, right? If a presidential co-partisan is willing to endorse any means for their president to accomplish an aim, that puts us in very dangerous territory in terms of our democratic health. So what we argue is that Americans, in fact, have principled views of how power is supposed to operate. While it's easy to imagine that views of the presidency and the person holding the presidency are identical, we find that that's not the case, right? We find that Americans can, in fact, separate their view of a president from their view of the institution of the presidency. There's my really impressive graphic. I'll do it one more time in case you missed it. There you go. You see now why I'm not a graphic designer, but a college professor. So we argue that when it comes to the use of presidential power, right, there are these separate attitudes. And that what I'm going to show you in a minute here is that those attitudes are driven by core democratic values. Right? Americans hold a view of the office and its powers as distinct from the individual holding the office. Now, to be clear, we argue and find compelling evidence of partisanship mattering here, but we also find clear evidence of an institutional lens. Just want to remind you, if you have any questions, put them in the chat, and I'm happy to take them as they come up. Okay, let me move on and show you some of our evidence. I want to paint a picture of public support for unilateral action. So we relied on several survey questions to measure public support, but I'm just going to focus on one. I'm going to focus on this question around unilateral policymaking, and that's the one I'll keep coming back to. But we asked other questions, and I'm happy to share those with you or talk more about them if there's interest. So we asked our survey takers their level of agreement with the statement you see on the screen. A president should have the right to enact policies without having those policies voted on by Congress. For shorthand, I'm going to refer to this as support for unilateral policymaking. And before I show you our evidence, I'm going to collect some data here. So you can, on your phone, if it's easier, on your computer, you can go to pollev.com/AJ Reeves. You can also, if you take your phone and just open up your camera app and scan the QR code, you can also, it'll take you right there. See, we have some results coming in already. And we'll give folks a minute or two to do that and see what we come up with. Very interesting, very interesting. I'll show you the results from a nationally representative survey in a bit. We see the crowd here is pretty closely divided, with a majority thinking that a president should have the right to enact policies without having those policies voted on by Congress. Wonder if that's because we have all these executives here, that have had to engage in these enterprises before, and maybe have an appetite for more executive power than others. Very interesting. So we asked this very question on nationally representative surveys. These were all surveys done out of the Weidenbaum Center. We asked this question 9 times between January 2014 and January 2018. And you see those results here. So on the vertical axis is the percent who agree that a president should have the right to enact policies without having those policies voted on by Congress. And then we've just ordered that by when we ask the question, starting in January 14, extending out to January 2018. Now, what we see here, which we didn't see in our Weidenbaum poll that I just gave, is that support for unilateral policymaking was quite low, right? Across polls, average support sat at below 20% and ranged from about 10% to 28%. So this is one piece of evidence for one of the book's takeaways, which is Americans don't like when presidents seek to enact policy independently without Congress. Now, one thing that might leap to mind is, okay, but what about partisanship? I told you we have this partisan lens. We had some evidence of this partisan lens. And the other thing you might have noticed is that because of this amazing Weidenbaum survey that we had going, we were able to ask this question under both President Obama and President Trump, right? So not only can I show you how support varies by partisanship, but how does support vary by partisanship when we see a switch in the partisanship of the president? So that's what we have on this slide, right? We see the exact same results, but we've broken it down by party. So if we look at January 2014, 33% of Democrats supported unilateral policymaking for their president, right, Barack Obama. The question wording is what you see on the screen. I just am referring to the fact that at this time, Obama was the president. 13% of Republicans felt that way, right? So we see a 20-point gap between Republicans and Democrats. This is a gap that switches when Trump becomes president, right? In January of 2018, 22% of Republicans supported unilateral power, while only 11% of Democrats agree. So it's a gap of 11 points. So undoubtedly, partisanship makes a difference here. But hold on, and I'll get to the question in the chat in just a minute. The first thing I want to note is that overall levels of support still sit well below 50% here, right? It's not as if 80% of Republicans are happy to see their president exercise unilateral power, right? Even in those favorable institutional conditions, it's still pretty middling levels of support, even among co-partisans. So there is some partisan variation, but an important takeaway here is that support is low overall. I also want to consider another context that might sort of give us a barometer here, which is presidential approval. Okay, so we have a couple of questions in the chat. One is how the response shifts in the context of specific policy, right? Specifically, this idea of foreign policy versus domestic policy. That's a phenomenal question, and it harkens back to this idea of the two presidencies thesis, where at least historically, Americans have been more willing to grant a president leverage in the sphere of foreign affairs. In other parts of the book, we explore exactly that question. We see consistent penalties when presidents take action across different policy areas, but we tend to see those dampened in areas of foreign policy. So there is some evidence, and one of the things that we spend a lot of time on in the book is sort of understanding the different contexts where these attitudes are particularly strong or not. So that's a great question. Gail Jackson asks whether there isn't something dynamic about this whole processes, whether support for these types of powers can ebb and flow. I think that's a marvelous question. Based on what we see on this slide and also this slide, right, we do in fact see some variation, right? Support is not constant over time. And so, one of the things that we spend a fair amount of time in the book exploring is whether particularly popular presidents are more able to take those unilateral actions without a public penalty. That's one area where we really don't find much evidence. Even when the popular president does it, the penalty is still pretty strong. Now, a popular president might feel more enabled to take those unilateral actions, and that's a slightly different question that we didn't examine. But these are two really marvelous questions. I would not dare suggest you buy an academic book for anybody for Christmas unless you really don't like them. But we do explore some of these questions further in different parts of the book. Thank you for those phenomenal questions. Okay, so the one thing I want to do before we move on from this discussion around partisanship is give you another context. All right, so what do you see here? You see the partisan gap between Republicans and Democrats in how they favor or not unilateral policymaking. Well, let's take another context where we know there's a high degree of polarization. Okay, this is these are the same results for presidential approval. Right, these results are from our very same survey takers. Again, on the vertical axis, you have the percent who approve of the way that the president is doing his job. On the horizontal axis, you have our dates. And then, of course, from November to May, November 16 to May 17, you have a switch in who holds the office of the presidency. This, my friends, is partisan polarization, right? We see giant gaps between Republicans and Democrats, and those gaps, flip when the partisanship of the president changes. So while there is partisan polarization when it comes to unilateral policymaking, the gap is relatively modest, right? We saw gaps between 4 and 29 points. For presidential approval, the partisan gap is as much as 18 times larger, ranging from 65 to 71 points. So to summarize, compared to presidential approval, support for unilateral power is lower overall, far more stable, and far less polarized. Okay. Next, I want to turn to this question of where these attitudes come from. And I want to start with just a brief discussion of the cover of our book. So the cover of our book there on the left is a stylized adaptation of a painting that you see on your right, depicting the pulling down of a statue of George III at Bowling Green, New York, July 9th, 1776, right? Just a couple of days or shortly following a public reading of the Declaration of Independence. Look, our book is not about removing statues or taking down statues, but this is a really nice depiction of our thesis in that, Americans do not like executive power. That disdain stems from values that Americans have about democracy. As a nation, right, this antipathy is perhaps best represented by the Declaration of Independence, right? What is the Declaration of Independence, right? Think about that for a moment. If you're a student, you can type it in the chat. Right, the Declaration of Independence is an indictment against kingly or executive power, right? It's this big, long indictment about the King of England, usurping these powers and taking authority beyond what is right. So just as these subjects here are committing this ultimate heresy in their rejection of a strong executive in the form of a king, right? We think that Americans today still regard these unilateral powers with suspicion. And that's what I'm going to focus on in the next few minutes of my talk here. So we spend considerable effort in the book exploring the origins of these attitudes. I see Jim Gibson is on the call. Like, one of the great fortunes of my career was to be in a department with Jim Gibson, where I stole all of his ideas that he'd been working on around the courts and tried to think about how they applied to the presidency. That was really one of the origins of this project. And one of the things that we borrowed from his research was this idea around support for the rule of law. And indeed, one of the most consistent findings in our book is that these attitudes towards the rule of law, right, a core small d democratic value, is an extremely robust and durable predictor of support for unilateral powers, right? That's even after doing all the fancy statistical stuff around controlling for partisanship and presidential approval and a whole host of other characteristics, right? Again and again and again, we find that the stronger a respondent's belief in the rule of law, the more opposed to unilateral power they are. So how did we do this? For all of our survey takers, we asked them to register their agreement with the 5 statements that you see on your screen, right? We then use that to form a measure, excuse me, a measure of support for the rule of law, right? These have to do with just how inviolable you think the law is, right? Is it ever okay to not follow a law that you consider unjust? Is there ever a time when it would be better to ignore the law and just come up with a solution if there's a really pressing problem, right? How necessary is it to follow the law? You can read the rest of these statements for yourself. Okay, before I move on, I want to again just take the temperature of the group. I'm going to adapt just one of these statements, and I'm going to again ask you whether you agree or disagree. It is necessary to obey a law even if you consider it unjust. You agree or disagree with that statement? Give folks another minute or two. Again, you can go to pollev.com/AJ Reeves. You can refresh it if you were just there, or you can scan that QR code. Very interesting. So right now we have about 2/3 of the group that agree it is necessary to obey a law even if you consider it unjust, and about 1/3 disagree. I mean, the other thing you guys are getting a little glimpse at like how the academic sausage is made, right? I'm sure you're imagining 100 different contexts that could play into your decision around that question. We're trying to sort of get the pure answer, which we do by asking this question and a number of other questions to come up with this scale. The results here are not different from what we might expect from a national population. Americans have a very strong commitment to the rule of law, these tend to the nationally representative surveys that we find tend to mirror this. Nina mentions that it might depend on the topic. Absolutely, right? You could imagine a really interesting research study where you tried to figure out where these principles might give way, which is not what we do in this particular case. Okay, thank you for indulging me and taking those survey questions. So our scale is formed from these questions, and what we find again and again and again, and I'm not going to belabor the empirical results, but we find that support for rule of law is an extremely robust predictor of unilateral power. For example, in our analysis, we find moving from the weakest support for rule of law to the highest support is associated with a 29 percentage point increase in the likelihood of opposing unilateral policymaking, right? That's comparable to the effect of moving from strongly supporting to strongly opposing a president in office, right? So we believe this is both a statistically significant finding and a substantively significant finding that we found again and again and again in the surveys that we asked. Okay, so where do these democratic values come from? Right? What shapes how we view the rule of law? We don't explicitly conduct analyses to answer this question, but we do spend some time considering it. Part of it may have to do with socialization, right? We learn about the Declaration of Independence and our nation's early experience with tyrannical executive power, right? When we go see Hamilton, right? King George is not the hero, right? He's the bad guy. And of course, we're reminded of this struggle each July 4th when we celebrate American independence. We learn about civics in high school. So it very well could be that our civic culture and our civic education make us skeptical of executive power. There's a team of scholars at the University of Chicago that I'm really jealous of because they came up with this phrase or this word tyrannophobic, right? And they wrote a whole book saying that Americans sort of have this innate tyrannophobia due in part to these forces. I should note that in one of the chapters of the book, we explore this question in a number of countries outside the United States. In part, we were wondering, is this a case of American exceptionalism? But it is not. It is not a case of American exceptionalism. We look at the relationship among citizens and executive power in other parts of the world and reach very similar conclusions. So it could very well be the case that, you know, while many political processes may be obscure, there's a basic innate desire to see political power exercised in a way that is not arbitrary. I mean, that's the definition of tyranny, right? It's one thing, perhaps, to know, you know, how many votes are required to override a filibuster, right? Steve Smith, the former director, wrote at least one, maybe more than one paper showing, you know, there's not really super strong attitudes out there around the filibuster. But we think it's perhaps something different, perhaps something more visceral when citizens react to a president avoiding the legislature or going, you know, through irregular means to accomplish his or her goals. I'll also note that when we look to the popular discourse, we often see presidential power attacked in the terms that I just described. Right. I know when a president takes a unilateral action, I can read the op-ed page of the Wall Street Journal the next day and get like great fodder for talks like this, right? Because when a president takes unilateral action to affect immigration policy, student loan debt, you know, levy new steel and aluminum tariffs, they're opening themselves up to the types of criticisms that we see here, right? And indeed, if we look to the process critiques related to presidential power, they're also frequently couched in the language of lawlessness and accompanied by depictions of the president as a king or emperor. Okay, so just to recap, Public support for unilateral power is weak, it's stable, and it's somewhat polarized. It's also driven by core values toward the rule of law, right? It's not coming from nowhere. It's not coming purely from partisanship. In other parts of the book that I'm not sharing with you today, we show that the public punishes unilateral policies. Again, there is some context dependence. Sometimes those penalties are really big, sometimes they're really small, but they're consistently in that negative direction. When I first started this project, I sort of thought, well, maybe there's like this, Dirty Harry, Clint Eastwood, like, yeah, we're really happy to see the president say, I don't care what the rules are, I'm just going to go get something done. Right? We don't find much evidence. We don't find any evidence of that. We find evidence to the contrary. We show that presidential approval is unrelated to support for unilateral policies. We do a bunch of historical examination of historical polls and the like. And we also show that these relationships exist in countries around the world. So let me conclude with just 3 thoughts. The first thing is, we have to remember, and as a scholar of the presidency, the thing that we learn and the thing that we say is that power is a North Star to the president, right? The institution from its point of origin had to grapple with this tension. America's founding with designing that office in a way that it could be, energetic, in the words of Alexander Hamilton, but not one that enabled tyranny. The institutional checks on the executive branch, which are often the first things that come to mind, right? I'm talking about Congress and the courts, have, at least in the past, left much to be desired, right? This is a great example where the president can not have to deal with the collective action problem, right? The president can simply do something. And then Congress, which is if nothing else, hamstrung by the collective action problem, faces a great challenge to stand up to those powers. And though it may be changing, right, the courts have, at least historically, been extremely deferential to the executive branch. So, that leaves you and me, right? I don't propose that the public is 100% effective antidote for executive aggrandizement, but the public also does not write a blank check for their preferred office holders, right? And I think this is really crucial for the health of democracy around the world. This study is now a couple years old, and maybe we are in new political waters that we would find something different if we were to start those surveys today or to start this project today. The third thing I'll say is that, we really need more research on how to ensure a vigilant citizenry. In writing this book and, sort of reading the literature out there, there seems to be a near constant refrain for more civics education. That may well be a good idea. I certainly have not seen empirical evidence, which is what I'm looking for, that it's the silver bullet, the magic bullet. And I would also note that, as young Americans enter a political system of limited economic mobility and see some of these ineffective and outmoded political institutions, that too is almost certainly eroding some of this deference for the rule of law. And when we looked, this wasn't a Trump phenomenon. This wasn't a Republican phenomenon. We did see, this lack of deference to the rule of law was especially prominent among younger Americans on both sides of the political spectrum. And so, those are sort of the thoughts that we were left with as we finished the book. All right, I'm going to skip the postscript and just say thanks. And let me go to the chat and look at some of these questions. If you have additional questions, please feel free to put them into the chat now. Okay, so Steve Knight has asked about um, uh, how executive power has grown, especially vis-a-vis the other branches since the Cold War. I think that's absolutely right. You know, I just should take a bit of a detour here, but one of the things we talk about in the book are people like Arthur Schlesinger, right, who was a great presidential advisor to Democratic presidents. Man, when FDR was was taking more aggressive action in the context of the presidency, when JFK was, taking more aggressive postures around presidential power, Schlesinger was over the moon and would write books saying how great this was. As soon as Nixon came into office, the tune changed and he was writing about the imperial presidency. Um, our foil to Schlesinger is George Will, who no matter what, no matter who's president, what's happening, George Will is always good for an op-ed saying that the expansion of presidential power is not a good thing. And that in part harkens back to what I was saying earlier about, Congress is so hamstrung by collective action, right? I mean, they have to get the votes to break the filibuster, get the presidential signature. Presidents can take these actions and there's no collective action problem there. And so, we have formal modelers and other presidential scholars that have sort of looked at that as one of the ways that presidents are just able to take these actions. And it's a reason why this is a question of interest here. I do think these are powers that threaten democracy. The one other thing I'll say is that, this book project began, and this sort of reflects my orientation as a presidency scholar, having lunch with John Rogowski right around the time when Obama demurred in Syria and said, I'm not going to take unilateral action. I want Congress to authorize this. And as scholars of the presidency, we just thought, why would a president ever not do this, right? It seemed like there was enough support in Congress. And so why would he be deferential in that context? And I don't know if it's particularly right in that instance, but one of the answers that we came back to was this public constraint. So thank you for that question. Okay, so Chris Floyd asked a question about civics. What can educators do to drive interest in these topics and educate people more so that people will be interested in these questions around civics? So I'm being a little bit of an academic here by saying, a lot of the studies around civics are really challenging, right? Because it's the best schools in the richest places that seem to have the best civics education. So, showing that those generate outcomes that make you a better citizen, I want to see the evidence, right? And if any of you have seen studies that are convincing to you, send them my way. Does it make sense to from a policy perspective to not do this and instead do civics? It very well could be, right? And maybe that is it. A lot of people feel that is the 100% right way to sort of reify these democratic institutions. And I just don't know what the answer is to that. I think we have to balance. If institutions stop working for people, if people lose faith in Congress, not because of some sort of experience with civics, but because Congress or the presidency or the courts aren't doing its job, I think that's really a dangerous thing. And part of it is, having institutions that work. And part of it is, as we talk about American democracy, there are incentives to be, very doom and gloom and to tear down those institutions and to talk about just how bad they are. And I think that can create a reinforcing cycle that is not good. And this time around, it might be this party, saying we're not going to, demur to these sort of democratic rules that we have. But it's easy enough to imagine that it's going to be the other political party the next time that this happens. Thank you for that question, Chris. Okay, so Peter asks, hasn't federal agencies increased power been significant versus individual rights? Oh yeah, this is a super interesting question. I mean, the proper role of the executive branch. I had a student that studied the bureaucracy, and there's always this long wind up of, oh, the bureaucracy, oh, it's boring. And it's like, no, the bureaucracy is like the deep state, like this is, for some people, like this is the thing that animates them, to become involved in politics. We don't specifically analyze the nature of the federal bureaucracy and attitudes there. I mean, generally, people are not big fans, and you sort of saw this in the case of Trump, where we have this sort of idea that the term is not coming to me, but the president and the bureaucracy are one, but increasingly we have, especially Trump, right, sort of running against the deep state and the bureaucracy. So those dynamics are very interesting and certainly worth exploring. So Nina asked a great question about what the current presidential candidates are saying about this. In olden times, the New York Times would actually send out a survey asking candidates about their views towards unilateral power. It's extremely interesting. They've stopped. I think the New York Times would do it, but candidates won't reply anymore. So I did. Okay, so Molly was asking about the postscript. This was something I was going to mention, which I think bears on Nina's question here. This is from a town hall that Sean Hannity did with Trump in the beginning of the month. So Hannity asks, I guess he doesn't ask, this is not a question, but he says, with a question mark at the end, to Trump, under no circumstances you are promising America tonight, would you never abuse power as retribution against anybody? Okay, so clearly this is something that Hannity is trying to get out there, that he thinks is important. Trump says, except for day one, I'm going to be, he keeps, I love this guy. He says, you're not going to be a dictator, are you? I said, no. Other than day one, we're closing the border and we're drilling. After that, I'm not a dictator. Okay, so I might be biased because of my research, but what I found to be interesting here, Trump is, I hope I won't get in political hot water for saying, Trump is not known for his self-restraint, right? Clearly, this is on the mind of Hannity, a friend of Trump, to get this line out that Trump isn't going to be a dictator. Trump does not, and this becomes a little bit of a news story, him saying except for day one, but there even tends to be some recognition that Trump has to say, the thing that he might not actually want to say, which is, well, I'm not going to be a dictator except for day one, and that just has to do with drilling and closing the border. Based on the reporting that's been going on, right? Trump's team is really thinking about how to use how to exercise the levers of the presidency to expand those powers. Back to Peter's question, in the context of the bureaucracy and creating this new schedule of federal employees that he can sort of hire and fire at will. The other thing to note here is that now we're a week or so away from that comment. It didn't look like it hurt Trump in Iowa. He's still dominating, at least in those polls. I don't know. Did he lose a couple of points on his national unfavorability ratings based on that? So all of this stuff is highly context dependent, and we're trying to sort of pull out the signal that we can measure in the midst of all of this noise of political reality. So yeah, that is, I'm not actively pursuing, we'll throw a survey question in this vein every once in a while on a new survey, but at least for now, like I said, this started with Obama in Syria. So I gave it away. I've been working on this over 10 years and wrote a number of articles and books. And so, we'll see what happens down the road, but that's sort of where we are with this project. Great. All right. Well, let me just say thank you to everyone. I'm sorry we aren't seeing each other in person, but it's great to, beam into everybody's living room or office or wherever you happen to be. I want to wish you the happiest of holidays. I know some of our Weidenbaum friends are, dealing with health issues and family issues and things like that. And so I just want to wish you all a really happy and joyous holiday season, and come back and bring your friends in the new year. So with that, I'll say goodbye to everybody.